22nd April 1943. RAF Sculthorpe, Norfolk, England. The hangar smelled of oil, burned rubber, and desperation. Under the dim yellow glow of a single overhead lamp, leading aircraft man Thomas "Tommy" Harwell knelt beside the starboard Rolls-Royce Merlin engine of a de Havilland Mosquito bomber, his hands blackened with grease, his pulse hammering in his ears. Around him, the night shift had gone silent. No one spoke. No one moved. They all knew what he was about to do, and they all knew it was strictly forbidden by Air Ministry regulations. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and Tommy's breath came out in white clouds as he worked. His fingers, stiff from the cold and slick with engine oil, fumbled with the boost governor linkage buried deep in the Merlin's mechanical heart. One wrong adjustment, one miscalculation, and the engine would tear itself apart at 20,000 feet. Or worse, it would fail over enemy territory, leaving 2 men to die in the wreckage of Britain's fastest bomber. Tommy wasn't just bending the rules, he was about to rewrite them. And if it worked, the crews flying these wooden wonders over the heart of Nazi Germany might just come home alive. If it failed, he'd be court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, and possibly imprisoned for sabotaging military equipment during wartime. But Tommy had stopped caring about regulations 3 weeks ago, when he'd helped pull the charred remains of Flight Sergeant David Morrison from the twisted wreckage of Mosquito DZ-401. Morrison had been 22 years old. He'd been engaged, and he'd been shot down by a Focke-Wulf FW-190 that his Mosquito simply couldn't outrun. Tommy tightened the last bolt, wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag, and stood up. His knees cracked. His back ached, but his eyes were clear. "It's done," he said quietly. "Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from? And what would you have done if your choice could mean life or death for your brothers in arms?" The de Havilland Mosquito was never supposed to exist. When Geoffrey de Havilland first pitched the concept in October 1938, the British Air Ministry laughed it out of the room. The air staff wanted heavy bombers, 4 engine giants like the Lancaster and the Stirling that could carry massive bomb loads deep into Germany. They wanted defensive armament, turrets bristling with 303 Browning machine guns, gunners to fight off interceptors, armor plate to protect the crew. What they didn't want was de Havilland's radical proposal, a twin-engine bomber made almost entirely of wood, with no defensive guns whatsoever, relying solely on speed to survive. It sounded less like a military aircraft and more like a death wish wrapped in plywood and good intentions. But Geoffrey de Havilland was not a man easily deterred. He'd been designing aircraft since before the First World War. He'd lost his own son, Geoffrey de Havilland, Jr., testing one of his experimental aircraft in 1946, but in 1938, that tragedy still lay in the unwritten future. What he knew then was that Britain was running out of time and running out of strategic materials. Aluminum was desperately needed for fighters, Spitfires and Hurricanes to defend the homeland. Steel was required for ships, tanks, and artillery. But wood? England had forests full of it. De Havilland's vision was elegant in its simplicity. Build a bomber from non-strategic materials. Balsa wood from Ecuador for the core, birch plywood for the skin, Canadian spruce for the longerons and stringers. Make it light, make it streamlined. Give it 2 powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engines that powered the Spitfire, and make it so fast that no German fighter could catch it. No guns meant no gunners. No gunners meant less weight. Less weight meant more speed and more fuel. More fuel meant deeper penetration into enemy territory. And speed. Speed meant survival. The Air Ministry remained skeptical, but by September 1939, with war declared and Britain's industrial capacity stretched to breaking point, they reluctantly approved a prototype. On 25 November 1940, at Salisbury Hall in Hertfordshire, Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. took the first Mosquito prototype into the air. He came back 20 minutes later with a smile that could have lit up London during the blackout. The prototype had reached 392 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, faster than the Spitfire MiG-2, faster than any bomber in the world, and faster than most fighters. The Air Ministry's skepticism evaporated overnight. By December 1940, orders were flooding in. The Mosquito wasn't just approved, it was fast-tracked into production. But fast is a relative term in aerial warfare. And by 1943, the Luftwaffe had caught up. When the Mosquito first entered operational service in May 1942 with 105 Squadron at RAF Swanton Morley, she was untouchable. Early missions over occupied France saw Mosquitoes flying deep into enemy territory in broad daylight, photographing German installations, bombing precision targets, and returning home without a scratch. German fighters, primarily the Messerschmitt Bf 109F and early variants of the Focke-Wulf F-191 190, simply couldn't catch them. But the Luftwaffe was not standing still. By mid-1942, the Germans had begun deploying improved variants of their frontline fighters. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A3 and A4 models, powered by the BMW 801D2 radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, could reach speeds of 408 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. In a shallow dive, they could touch 401 meters, 40 meters. More importantly, they could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, fast, enough to intercept a Mosquito before it could reach safety. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G, nicknamed the Gustav, was equally dangerous. With a Daimler-Benz DB605A engine producing 1,475 horsepower and equipped with a methanol water boost system called MW750, the Gustav could briefly reach speeds exceeding 400 mph. Its climb rate was phenomenal, 4,000 feet per minute under optimal conditions. And then there were the night fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 110G and the Junkers Ju 88C6, both equipped with Liechtenstein BC airborne interception radar, were specifically designed to hunt bombers in the dark. They couldn't match the Mosquito's speed, but they didn't need to. With radar guidance from ground controllers and their own onboard systems, they could position themselves ahead of the bomber's stream and strike from ambush. By early 1943, Mosquito losses were climbing. Crews were reporting increasingly aggressive interceptions. German pilots had learned that if they could catch a Mosquito in a climb or a turn, moments, when the aircraft's speed advantage evaporated, they could bring it down with a single burst from their 20mm MG 151 cannons or 30mm Mk 108 autocannons. The math was brutal. The Mosquito BMKI's maximum speed of 380 mph at 17,000 feet was no longer fast enough. The Germans had closed the gap, and men were dying because of it. Leading aircraft man Thomas Harwell was not supposed to be the man who changed the war. Born in 1919 in the village of Much Wenlock, Shropshire, Tommy was the youngest of 4 brothers. His father had been a blacksmith, his mother a seamstress. The family lived in a stone cottage with a thatched roof and no electricity until 1935. Tommy grew up working with his hands, shoeing horses, repairing farm equipment, rebuilding engines for the handful of automobiles that wealthy landowners drove through the countryside. He'd joined the RAF in August 1940, just as the Battle of Britain was reaching its crescendo. He'd wanted to be a pilot, but his eyesight wasn't quite good enough. Instead, he was trained as an aircraft mechanic and assigned to RAF Marham in Norfolk, where he worked on Vickers Wellington bombers. The work was hard, often dangerous, and always exhausting. Mechanics worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, in all weather conditions. They worked through air raids, through freezing winters and sweltering summers. They worked with inadequate tools, insufficient spare parts, and constant pressure from above to keep more aircraft operational. Faster. But Tommy loved it. He loved the smell of high-octane aviation fuel, the roar of a Merlin engine at full throttle, the satisfaction of diagnosing a problem that had stumped everyone else. He was good at it, too. By 1942, he'd been promoted to leading aircraft man and transferred to RAF Sculthorpe, where 105 Squadron was transitioning from Blenheims to Mosquitoes. The Mosquito was unlike anything Tommy had worked on before. She was sleek, elegant, almost delicate-looking compared to the heavy bombers. But underneath that wooden skin was a machine of incredible sophistication. The twin Rolls-Royce Merlin. 21 engines were masterpieces of engineering. Liquid-cooled V12s with two-stage, two-speed superchargers, producing 1,460 horsepower each at +9 psi boost pressure. Tommy spent his days, and often his nights, maintaining these engines. He learned their quirks, their temperament, their limits. He learned how they sounded when they were running perfectly, and how they sounded when something was wrong. He learned to read the cylinder head temperature gauges, the oil pressure readings, the coolant flow rates. He learned to diagnose problems by touch, by smell, by instinct, and he learned, after watching too many crews come back shot to pieces or not come back at all, that the Merlin engine was capable of far more than Air Ministry regulations allowed. Tommy's breakthrough came on a cold February night in 1943, during a routine post-flight inspection of Mosquito DZ-414. The aircraft had just returned from a night raid on Cologne. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Peter Robbins, had reported being chased by a Bf-110 night fighter over the Dutch coast. He'd pushed the throttles to maximum power and just barely managed to escape. But the encounter had left him shaken. "We were flat out," Peter told Tommy as they stood beside the aircraft, their breath misting in the frigid air. "Everything we had. And he was still gaining on us. If we'd been over land instead of water, if he'd had another 30 seconds, we'd be dead." Tommy nodded silently, then climbed up onto the wing to inspect the engines. He ran his hands over the cowlings, checking for damage, for cracks, for any sign of stress. Everything looked normal. He opened the inspection panels and examined the supercharger housings, the coolant lines, the exhaust manifolds, and then he noticed something: the cylinder head temperatures, recorded on a strip chart inside the cockpit, showed that both engines had been running significantly cooler than their maximum rated temperature during the escape. The coolant temperatures were well within safe limits. The oil pressure had remained stable throughout. In other words, the engines hadn't been working nearly as hard as they could have been. Tommy knew the reason: the boost governor. Every Merlin engine was equipped with a mechanical governor that automatically limited the boost pressure, the amount of compressed air forced into the cylinders by the supercharger, to a maximum of +9 pounds per square inch. This prevented overboosting, which could cause detonation, premature ignition of the fuel-air mixture, overheating, and catastrophic engine failure. But Tommy had a theory. What if the +9 psi limit wasn't a hard mechanical constraint, but rather a conservative safety margin? What if the Merlin could safely handle +12 psi, or even +15 psi, for short periods without failing? He started researching. He read technical manuals. He studied engineering reports from Rolls-Royce. He talked to other mechanics, to engine fitters, to anyone who might know the answer. What he found surprised him. The Merlin engine had been designed with substantial safety margins built in. The original Merlin third variant, used in early Spitfires and Hurricanes, had operated at boost pressures as high as +112 psi during combat trials in 1940. The Merlin 45, used in later Spitfire variants, routinely operated at pleasant 16 psi with a special 100-octane fuel blend. The Merlin 21, used in the Mosquito, was actually a more robust engine than the Merlin 3. It had stronger crankshaft bearings, improved cooling systems, and better metallurgy. There was no technical reason it couldn't handle higher boost pressures, except that Air Ministry regulations, written in the cautious early days of the war, had never been updated to reflect these improvements. Tommy realized something that the bureaucrats at the Air Ministry hadn't. The rules were obsolete. The Merlin could do more. The Mosquito could be faster. He just had to prove it. The modification itself was deceptively simple and terrifyingly dangerous. Boost governor on a Merlin 21 engine consisted of a spring-loaded mechanical linkage connected to the throttle and the supercharger. As the pilot advanced the throttle, the governor allowed more boost pressure to build, but only up to plumb time by B by B by C, at which point a relief valve opened and vented excess pressure back into the intake system. Tommy's plan was to modify this linkage to allow the pilot to manually override the governor and push the boost pressure higher. He would install a secondary control, a small lever mounted on the throttle quadrant, that would physically bypass the relief valve and allow boost pressures up to 115 psi. But there were risks, serious risks. At plus 12 psi, the engine would be operating at approximately 110% of its rated power output. Cylinder head temperatures would increase by 50 to 75 Weber by 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The mechanical stress on the pistons, connecting rods, and crankshaft would increase proportionally. The risk of detonation, which could destroy an engine in seconds, would skyrocket if the fuel-air mixture wasn't precisely calibrated. And there was another problem: the propellers. The Mosquito used de Havilland Hydromatic constant-speed propellers, which automatically adjusted their pitch to maintain optimal engine RPM. But at higher boost pressures, the propellers might not be able to shed the extra power efficiently, causing the engines to over-rev and potentially disintegrate. Tommy would have to modify not just the boost governor, but also the propeller governor and the fuel mixture controls. He would have to recalibrate the engine instruments. He would have to reinforce the engine mounts to handle the increased vibration, and he would have to do all of this in secret, because if the engineering officer found out, Tommy would be facing a court-martial. He started work on 18th April 1943, during the night shift when supervision was minimal. He chose DZ-414, Peter Robbins's aircraft, as his test bed, partly because Peter had volunteered, and partly because Tommy trusted him to fly it properly. Over 4 nights, working alone in the dimly lit hangar, Tommy carefully disassembled the boost governor linkages on both engines. He fabricated a bypass mechanism from spare parts, a simple lever assembly that could be engaged by pulling a small handle mounted just below the throttle levers. He adjusted the fuel mixture screws to run slightly richer at high boost, reducing the risk of detonation. He recalibrated the propeller governors to allow an extra 200 RPM at maximum power. He tested everything on the ground, running the engines at high power for short bursts and monitoring every gauge, every temperature, every vibration. The engines screamed, the airframe shook, but nothing broke. On the night of 22nd April 1943, Tommy signed off the maintenance log and handed the aircraft back to Peter Robbins. "She's ready," he said. "But listen carefully. You can use this," he indicated the bypass lever, "for no more than 3 minutes at a time. Any longer, and the cylinder heads will overheat. You'll see the temperatures climb into the red. When that happens, you pull back immediately. Understood?" Peter nodded. "Understood. And one more thing," Tommy added quietly. "If this goes wrong, if the engines fail, tell them it was mechanical failure. Don't tell them what I did. I don't want you going down with me." Peter smiled grimly. "If the engines fail over Germany, Tommy, we'll all be going down together." The mission briefing on the evening of 22nd April 1943 was routine. 4 Mosquitoes from 105 Squadron would fly a night raid on a railway marshalling yard near Cologne. The target was strategically important. It was a major logistics hub for German forces in the Ruhr, but it was also heavily defended. Flak batteries, searchlights, and night fighters. Peter Robbins and his navigator, Sergeant Colin Fletcher, climbed into DZ-414 at 2130 hours. The ground crew pulled away the wheel chocks. The Merlins coughed to life, their exhaust flames glowing blue in the darkness. They taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and took off into a moonless sky. The flight across the North Sea was uneventful. They climbed to 15,000 feet, settled into formation with the other 3 Mosquitoes, and turned southeast toward the Dutch coast. The channel slipped away beneath them, invisible in the darkness. Ahead, the first searchlights were beginning to probe the sky. They crossed into German-occupied Holland at 2240 hours. Almost immediately, Colin Fletcher's voice crackled over the intercom. Radar contact, 6 o'clock low. Closing fast. Peter's stomach tightened. He scanned his mirrors but saw nothing. Just darkness. Range? He asked. 2,000 yards. Still closing. Peter eased the throttles forward. The Merlins responded smoothly, and the airspeed climbed from 282 liters to 310 liters. But Colin's voice came again, more urgent this time. He's still gaining. Definitely a night fighter. Probably a 110. The Messerschmitt Bf 1-10? Twin engine, heavily armed, equipped with radar. And closing fast. Peter pushed the throttles to their normal maximum stops. The airspeed reached 340 meters, then 360. The Mosquito was flying flat out by conventional standards, but it wasn't enough. 1,000 yards, Colin reported. He's lining up for a shot. Peter's hand dropped to the small lever Tommy had installed. He hesitated for just a moment, then pulled it. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The Merlins exploded into a banshee shriek as the boost pressure surged past Plundry Peen PSI, past Pleasant 12, all the way to Plunton 15. The entire airframe shuddered violently. Peter was slammed back into his seat as the Mosquito leapt forward, like a racehorse stung by a wasp. The airspeed indicator spun wildly. 380 pish. 400 mi. 420 mi. Colin later described it as feeling like riding a bullet. The vibration was so intense that he could barely read his instruments. The engine noise was deafening even through his leather helmet. But the radar contact behind them was falling away fast. "He's lost us," Colin shouted over the intercom. "He's breaking off!" Peter held the throttles wide open for 2 full minutes, long enough to put 5 miles between them and the night fighter. Then he glanced at the engine temperature gauges and felt his blood run cold. Both cylinder head temperature needles were buried in the red zone. The coolant temperatures were climbing rapidly. Warning lights flickered on the panel. He pulled the bypass lever back and eased the throttles to normal power. The engines settled back into their familiar purr. The temperatures began to drop. They completed the mission without further incident, dropped their bombs on the target, and turned for home. As they crossed the English coast just after 0300 hours, Peter realized his hands were still trembling. They landed at Sculthorpe, taxied to the dispersal, and shut down the engines. Peter sat in the cockpit for a long moment, listening to the ticking of cooling metal. Before he finally climbed out, Tommy Harwell was waiting by the hangar, a cigarette glowing in his hand. Peter walked over to him, grabbed him by the shoulders, and said just 3 words. It bloody worked. By dawn on 23rd April, every pilot in 105 Squadron knew about Peter's escape. By noon, they were queuing up at Tommy's workbench, asking, begging for the same modification. Tommy worked cautiously at first. He modified one aircraft, then waited a week to see if any problems emerged. When none did, he modified 2 more, then 4, then 8. He trained a small group of trusted mechanics to help him. Corporal James Jimmy MacLeod from Glasgow, a lanky Scotsman with a genius for improvisation. Aircraftman First Class Henry Walsh from Birmingham, who could fabricate parts from scrap metal with nothing but a file and a bench vise. And leading aircraftman Robert Bobby Chen, the son of Chinese immigrants, who had an almost supernatural ability to diagnose engine problems by sound alone. Together, they worked the night shifts, modifying aircraft while the officers slept, and the day crews were off duty. They called it the Tommy Special. Pilots called it the Cheat Code. Ground crews called it the Miracle. And it worked. Throughout May and June of 1943, Mosquito crews flying Tommy-modified aircraft reported successful evasions of German fighters that should have caught them. Mission after mission, crews came back alive who, by all rights, should have died. Loss rates for 105 Squadron dropped from 4.2% in March to 1.8% in June. But secrets, especially in wartime, have a way of escaping. On 14th of May 1943, Wing Commander Hugh Edwards, CO of 105 Squadron, walked into the hangar at 200 hours and found Tommy elbow-deep in the engine of Mosquito. DZ-427. Edwards was a legend, an 40-year Australian pilot who'd won the Victoria Cross for leading a suicidal low-level daylight raid on Bremen in July 1941. He was also a strict disciplinarian who believed in regulations, procedures, and the chain of command. Tommy froze when he saw Edwards approaching. This was it. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly prison, but Edwards didn't shout. He didn't even look angry. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching Tommy work. Finally, he spoke. "How many have you done?" Tommy swallowed hard. 14, sir." "And how many have we lost to engine failure since you started?" "None, sir." Edwards nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. He was silent for a long moment, staring at the Merlin engine as if it held the answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. "I flew DZ-414 last week," Edwards said quietly. "Peter let me try his special throttle. Fastest I've ever flown. Felt like the aircraft wanted to leave the sky altogether." Tommy said nothing. There was nothing to say. "The Air Ministry wouldn't approve this," Edwards continued. "Too risky, too unconventional. They'd rather lose aircraft than bend the rules." "Yes, sir," Tommy said quietly. Edwards looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled, just slightly. "Good thing I'm not the Air Ministry. Carry on, Harwell. And next time, modify my aircraft first." He turned and walked out of the hangar. Tommy stood there, wrench still in hand, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. Wing Commander Edwards had just given him official permission. Unofficial, of course, but permission nonetheless to continue breaking the rules. By July 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. Mosquito squadrons across Bomber Command were reporting anomalous performance data. Aircraft were flying faster than their specifications allowed. Crews were evading interceptions that should have been unavoidable. Fuel consumption was higher than normal, suggesting engines were operating beyond rated power. An investigative team from the air, Ministry's Directorate of Technical Development, arrived at RAF Sculthorpe on 12th of July 1943. They came unannounced, accompanied by 2 Rolls-Royce engineers and a representative from the Ministry of Aircraft Production. They demanded access to all maintenance logs. They interviewed pilots, navigators, and ground crew. They inspected aircraft, and within 3 days, they discovered Tommy's modifications. The lead investigator, a wing commander named Arthur Pemberton, was furious. He threatened disciplinary action against everyone involved. Tommy, the mechanics who'd helped him, even Wing Commander Edwards for failing to report the unauthorized modifications. "This is sabotage," Pemberton declared during a heated meeting in the squadron commander's office. "You've compromised the structural integrity of military aircraft. You've violated Air Ministry regulations. People could have died because of this reckless stupidity." Edwards, to his credit, didn't back down. "People did die," he said coldly. "They died because our aircraft weren't fast enough. Harwell fixed that. And if you want to court-martial him for saving lives, you'll have to court-martial me first." The meeting ended in a stalemate. Pemberton stormed off, promising to file a formal report with the Air Ministry. Tommy waited for the axe to fall, but it didn't. Instead, something unexpected happened. The test pilots got involved. On 29 July 1943, a specially modified Mosquito BMK-4 was delivered to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough for testing. The aircraft had been fitted with Tommy's boost governor bypass and additional instrumentation to precisely measure engine performance, stress, and temperatures. The test pilot was squadron leader Jeffrey Ambler, one of the RAF's most experienced experimental pilots. He approached the assignment with skepticism. "I've seen too many field modifications that looked brilliant on the ground and nearly killed people in the air," he told the engineering team before the first flight. "We'll find out what this thing can really do, and whether it's safe." The first test flight took place on 2 August 1943. Ambler took the Mosquito up to 20,000 feet, leveled off, and carefully engaged the boost override. He pushed the engines to plus 112 psi and held them there while engineers on the ground monitored telemetry data transmitted by radio. The results were remarkable. At plus 112 psi boost, the Mosquito reached a sustained speed of 415 miles per hour, 35 by 317 faster than the rated maximum. Cylinder head temperatures climbed but stabilized within acceptable limits. Coolant temperatures remained manageable. There was increased vibration, but nothing that suggested structural failure. Ambler pushed further. He climbed to 25,000 feet and engaged a shallow dive, pushing the boost to plus 115 psi. The Mosquito accelerated through 430 turns, then 440 matomic, before Ambler pulled back, unwilling to push the airframe beyond its design limits. He landed 45 minutes later, visibly impressed. "It works," he told the engineers. "It actually bloody works. The engines are stressed, yes. They're operating beyond their rated capacity, yes. But they're not failing. And the performance gain is extraordinary." Over the next 2 weeks, the RAE conducted exhaustive testing. They ran endurance tests, measuring how long the engines could sustain high boost without failure. They tested different fuel mixtures, different propeller settings, different altitude profiles. They pushed the Mosquito to its absolute limits, and in every test, Tommy's modification performed flawlessly. On 18 August 1943, Squadron Leader Ambler filed his official report. His conclusion was unequivocal. "The modified boost system provides a significant tactical advantage with acceptable risk. Recommend immediate adoption for operational squadrons engaged in high-threat environments." On 8 September 1943, the Air Ministry issued Technical Order 2847, officially authorizing modified boost settings for Mosquito BMK-4 and BMK-9 aircraft. The order was classified restricted and distributed only to squadron commanders and senior engineering officers. The modifications were sanitized, tested, and standardized. Rolls-Royce engineers redesigned the boost. Governor to include a war emergency power setting, activated. By pushing the throttles fully forward and then pulling them back slightly. That would allow plus 112 psi boost for up to 5 minutes, without manual override. This made the system safer and easier to use in combat. By November 1943, every Mosquito squadron in Bomber Command had received the upgrade. The performance gains were immediate and dramatic. Mosquitoes began flying missions that would have been suicidal just months earlier. They struck Berlin in broad daylight. They hunted U-boats in the Bay of Biscay. They flew photo-reconnaissance missions deep into occupied Europe, racing ahead of the Allied bomber streams to mark targets with colored flares. The Germans noticed. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from late 1943 expressed alarm at the Mosquito's improved performance. One report, captured after the war, read, "The enemy's Mosquito aircraft have become significantly faster over the past 3 months. Our fighters can no longer intercept them reliably. Recommend development of higher performance interceptors as a matter of urgency." But by then, it was too late. The Mosquito had become untouchable. Speed, however, came at a cost, and not just to the engines. On 3rd of February 1944, Flight Lieutenant Peter Robbins and Sergeant Colin Fletcher took off from RAF Sculthorpe on what should have been a routine mission, a night raid on a synthetic oil plant near Brunswick. It was Peter's 47th operational sortie. He was due to be rotated off operations in 2 weeks. They never came back. German flak batteries caught them on the bomb run. A shell exploded beneath the fuselage, shredding the starboard engine and setting the wing on fire. Peter tried to maintain control, tried to limp back toward Allied lines, but the fire spread too quickly. At 02:47 hours, DZ-414, the first aircraft Tommy had ever modified, the aircraft that had proven the concept worked, broke apart in mid-air and fell burning into a snow-covered field south of Brunswick. Neither Peter nor Colin survived. Tommy took the news hard. He blamed himself, even though there was nothing his modification could have done to prevent flak damage. Wing Commander Edwards tried to reassure him, telling him that Peter had died doing what he loved, that he'd saved dozens of other crews with his willingness to test the modification, that his sacrifice had meaning. But Tommy couldn't shake the guilt. For weeks afterward, he worked in near silence, going through the motions, barely speaking to anyone. It was Bobby Chen, the quiet mechanic from Birmingham, who finally pulled him aside. "Peter knew the risks," Bobby said. "He chose to fly that aircraft because he believed in what you'd done. He believed it would save lives. And it has, Tommy." "It has," Tommy nodded slowly. He didn't feel absolved. But he kept working, because the war wasn't over, and there were still men who needed to come home. For those interested in the precise technical details, here's how Tommy's modification worked. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 21 engine used a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger to compress intake air and force it into the cylinders. Boost pressure, measured in pounds per square inch, PSI, above atmospheric pressure, directly determined engine power output. At 0.9 PSI, the standard setting, set to meteo 10.2, each Merlin 21 produced approximately 1,460 horsepower at 3,000 RPM. This gave the Mosquito a maximum speed of 300 bp, 480 trim at optimal altitude. Tommy's modification allowed boost pressure to be increased to 112 p, 520 p, which increased power output to approximately 1,620 horsepower per engine, an 11% increase. This translated to a top speed of 415 ATB at 20,000 feet, a 9% improvement that was often the difference between escape and interception. In emergency situations, pilots could briefly push boost to plus 115 psi, producing nearly 1,750 horsepower per engine and speeds exceeding 430 meters. But this could only be sustained for 60 to 90 seconds before cylinder head temperatures exceeded safe limits. The key trade-off was engine longevity. Under normal conditions, a Merlin 21 engine had a mean time between overhauls, MTBO, of approximately 500 flight hours. With Tommy's modification, that dropped to 250 to 300 hours. Spark plugs fouled more quickly. Piston rings wore faster. Coolant systems required more frequent maintenance. But the RAF accepted this trade-off. Engines could be rebuilt or replaced. Dead aircrew could not. By the end of World War II, the Mosquito had compiled one of the most extraordinary service records of any aircraft in history. Over 7,781 Mosquitoes were built between 1940 and 1950. They served in every theater of war: Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Far East, and the Pacific. Mosquitoes flew 28,000+ operational sorties during the war. Their loss rate was 1.8%, the lowest of any Allied bomber type. By comparison, the Lancaster had a loss rate of 3.5%, the B-17 Flying Fortress 4.2%, and the B-24 Liberator 4.5%. They dropped over 26,000 tons of bombs on targets across occupied Europe. They sank dozens of ships in anti-shipping strikes. They destroyed countless locomotives, bridges, and supply depots in precision, low-level attacks. And they did it all while flying faster than almost anything else in the sky. Tommy's modification was only part of the Mosquito's success story, but it was an important part. It gave crews the confidence to fly deep into enemy territory, knowing they had a chance, a real chance, of outrunning anything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Tommy Harwell was quietly promoted to sergeant in October 1943 and awarded a mention in dispatches for exceptional technical initiative and devotion to duty. He never received a medal. His name never appeared in the newspapers. The story of his modification remained classified until the 1970s. He survived the war, returned to Shropshire, and married his sweetheart, Elizabeth Morrison, David Morrison's younger sister. They had 3 children and ran a small garage in Much Wenlock for 40 years. Tommy rarely talked about his wartime service. His children didn't know the full story until after his death in 1987, when a former Mosquito pilot named James Fletcher, Colin Fletcher's younger brother, attended the funeral and told them what their father had done. "Your dad saved my brother's life," James said quietly. Not just once, but every time Colin flew. And he saved hundreds of other men, too. He was a hero. He just never wanted anyone to make a fuss about it. At reunions of 105 Squadron and other Mosquito units, veterans would raise a glass to Tommy Harwell and the aircraft that wouldn't die. They told stories of racing across the night sky at impossible speeds, laughing at German fighters that couldn't catch them, trusting in the Merlins and the man who'd made them better. Wing Commander Hugh Edwards, who went on to become an Air Vice Marshal, wrote in his memoirs, "The Mosquito was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was men like Tommy Harwell, quiet, determined, willing to break the rules when the rules were wrong, who made her truly unbeatable." War is often remembered for the generals who planned the campaigns, the pilots who flew the missions, the soldiers who stormed the beaches, and they deserve to be remembered. Their courage was real. Their sacrifices were profound. But war is also won by the mechanics who work in the dark, the engineers who refuse to accept that a problem can't be solved, the men and women who see what needs to be done and do it. Regulations be damned. Tommy Harwell never fired a shot in anger. He never dropped a bomb or flew a combat mission, but he saved lives. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands if you count the ripple effects. The missions that succeeded because a crew made it home. The intelligence gathered because a photo reconnaissance Mosquito outran its pursuers. The targets destroyed because a bomber had the speed to penetrate enemy defenses and return. In the frozen skies over occupied Europe, where every second mattered, and every mile per hour was the difference between life and death, Tommy Harwell gave men a fighting chance, and in the end, that was enough. But across the Channel, in the dark waters of the Atlantic, another kind of battle was raging, one fought not in the sky but beneath the waves. Join us next time as we uncover the untold story of the U-boat hunter, who sank 7 German submarines in a single month, and the secret weapon that turned the tide of the Atlantic War. Don't forget to subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered.